Mr. Bradford laughed, a wet, coffee laugh. "Boss, come on now. I'm more than your boss. We're family." "Yes," Mrs. Craig said, sounding almost ashamed. "Barnaby is my older brother." Geez, now it made sense why Mrs. Craig was so crabby all the time. Who'd want to be related to that? Abby started barking and acting a bit jumpy, so I put her on the leash. Meanwhile, Mr. Bradford walked over to Mrs. Craig's car. "Do you have the paperwork?" Mrs. Craig nodded. "Yes, in the glove compartment." I was confused. "What's he getting?" I asked. "It's unfortunate that it didn't work out with Agnes and your family," Mr. Bradford said. Her first name was Agnes? Agnes Craig? Geez, I was really starting to feel sorry for this lady. Mr. Bradford pulled an envelope out of the car. "It's very important to match up the right babysitters with the right families. Unfortunately, this was not an ideal match." He held up the envelope. "This is Mrs. Craig's evaluation of your family, so I can get right back to work providing a more suitable match for you next time. Well, good afternoon, everybody." As he headed back to the van, Abby got even more jumpy. "You have to control that dog," Mrs. Craig whispered to me. But this time it seemed like she was more worried than mad. "I'm trying," I said, but I was failing. Daisy tried to help, but she was no use. Abby dragged us all over to Mr. Bradford's van, where she started pawing at the door. Mr. Bradford looked annoyed. "What is that mutt doing?" he snarled, trying to swat Abby away and open the van door at the same time. "I'll make her stop," I said. The last thing I needed was for Abby to cause trouble with the head of the whole babysitting company. I bent over and said "stop" in as firm a voice as I could. And Abby did stop, just long enough for me and Daisy to loosen our grip on her leash, at which point she jumped through the window of the van right into the front seat. "Not again!" I screamed. I tried to pull Abby out, but she was already tearing through something that was on the passenger seat. "What's that dog doing?" Mr. Bradford hollered, reaching into the van and trying to grab Abby's collar. But she hopped to the back seat and got away. I looked through the window and noticed what she was digging into, an entire box of candy bars. It looked like she'd already eaten about 3. "Abby, you're going to get sick again," I screamed. If she threw up in Mr. Bradford's car, she was going back to the shelter for sure. Luckily, Mr. Bradford was able to grab Abby. She still had something in her mouth, though, and as Mr. Bradford pulled her through the window, she dropped it right on top of the envelope he was holding. It was half of a chocolate bar, still in its wrapper. "Hey!" Mr. Bradford hollered, staring at his chocolate-covered envelope. He quickly grabbed the candy bar, wrapper and all, and threw it on the ground. "You shouldn't litter," Daisy said. "You shouldn't have a dog that steals," he said back. I looked down at the wrapper. It looked just like the one that Abby found on our street after the car pulled away the night before, which had also been dropped on the ground by a litterer, wearing a striped shirt. "Hold on a second. Mr. Bradford, were you outside our house last night?" I asked. "Of course not," he said, but I could tell he was lying. "What were you doing there, and who was the other person you were with?" "What's going on?" Daisy asked. "I heard Mr. Bradford talking to someone outside my house," I told her. "He was asking that person to bring him something. Isn't that right, Mr. Bradford?" He laughed, as if I need to explain myself to a couple of children. Mr. Bradford opened the door to his van, but before he could get in, Abby jumped up and started pawing at the envelope in his hands, which was still smeared with chocolate. "Abby, you're being such a pig," I yelled. "Stop it." I tried to yank her away, but Abby just started pawing harder. "Get off me," yelled Mr. Bradford, trying to push Abby off. But as he swatted at her, the envelope fell to the ground. Before anyone could react, Abby ripped open the envelope and started licking it all over. She was only interested in the chocolate, but the rest of us were staring at what had fallen out of the envelope. It wasn't an evaluation or even a piece of paper at all. It was something small and shiny. At first I couldn't tell what it was, but then I saw it glisten in the sunlight. It was a beautiful diamond necklace. My mother's diamond necklace. Her favorite diamond necklace. The one she'd worn 2 nights earlier. The one Mrs. Craig had called truly magnificent. My heart started racing. My blotch felt like it was going to explode. I looked at Mrs. Craig. She was making a face I'd never seen her make before. I couldn't quite figure it out at first. Then I realized what it was. She was scared. This isn't what it looks like," she stammered. "Your parents gave me the necklace as a going-away present." I stared at her. I realized exactly what was happening, and I suddenly felt totally calm, like I was the one in control for once, like Jonah Forrester, like Hank Barlow, like Daisy, like Abby. "I know what you two are," I said. "You're criminals. You're thieves. You stole my mother's necklace, and you're going to go to jail." "I can explain," whispered Mrs. Craig, but it was clear she couldn't. She shrank backward and started crying. "Oh, stop your sobbing," Mrs. Bradford snarled at his sister, "unless you're crying because you feel bad, because you ruined everything." He was pacing like a caged animal. "I'm sorry, Barnaby," she muttered. Mr. Bradford bent down to put the necklace in his pocket, then turned to us. "It's a shame that you kids had to get caught in the middle of all this," he said. "I'm sure you understand. It's very important that none of you ever mention any of this to anyone, ever. You have no idea what happened to the necklace. If you ever say anything, someone might get hurt." Daisy and I stood there, frozen. Mr. Bradford reached for Abby. "Now about this dog here. I need to take her with me. I'm sure you understand." "I don't understand, and you can't have her," I said as Abby growled. "Oh, don't you worry. I'll give her a good home." "I don't believe you." "These kids did nothing wrong," Mrs. Craig said. She looked at Abby, and the dog is a little nuts, but, well, kind of cute. "This is none of your concern," Mr. Bradford sneered at his sister. Mr. Bradford was just about to grab Abby when the next totally crazy thing happened. "Enough!" Mrs. Craig yelled. Then, without another word, Mrs. Craig suddenly ripped her own hair off her head. That's right. I said her own hair off her head, and wrapped it around Mr. Bradford's eyes like a blindfold. "Your beautiful red hair!" I exclaimed. "It's a wig? Mrs. Craig, you're bald!" "Must be a family condition," Daisy explained. "Baxter's bald, too." Fact. There are a lot of great bald people in the world, but unfortunately, none of them are in this book. "That's not important right now," I said, which was the understatement of the year. Meanwhile, Mr. Bradford was flailing around. "What are you doing?" he screamed at his sister. "Run, kids," Mrs. Craig yelled. "Take Abby and run for your lives." And so we did. We ran for our lives. 5 seconds later, Mr. Bradford was running after us.